1943. A Nazi steps off a train. In Texas. It is a scene of profound historical irony. The men of the Wehrmacht, the vaunted soldiers of the Third Reich, were not marching through the streets of London or Moscow. They were arriving utterly defeated in the vast, dusty, and deeply unfamiliar heartland of America, where the war was a distant echo, not a daily reality. This was a consequence of the crushing Allied victory in North Africa, a campaign that yielded an unimaginable harvest of prisoners. Over 250,000 German and Italian troops, suddenly needing accommodation. The United States was utterly unprepared for this scale of captive intake. The solution was simple, brutal, and massive. Build a network of camps across the country, utilizing isolated, underpopulated areas. And nowhere was more isolated or more perfectly suited for this grim logistical necessity than the state of Texas. By the war's end, Texas would host over 70 permanent and branch POW camps, holding an estimated 50,000 Axis prisoners. From the arid plains of Hereford in the Panhandle to the humid pine forests of Camp Swift near Austin, the Lone Star State became, in effect, a massive, involuntary German colony. But this was no ordinary imprisonment. Under the strict, if often grudgingly applied, terms of the 1929 Geneva Convention, these captured soldiers, or Kriegsgefangene, were afforded rights that baffled and often infuriated the American public. They were not criminals. They were soldiers. And the U.S. Army, desperate to maintain the moral high ground and ensure reciprocal treatment for its own men captured in Europe, treated them accordingly. The result was a bizarre, almost surreal existence for the German POWs, particularly at camps like Camp Hearne near Bryan, Texas. Camp Hearne, which opened in June 1943, quickly gained the ominous nickname among some U.S. guards as Führer's Country Club. It was a slight exaggeration, perhaps, but one rooted in fact. The prisoners, primarily drawn from Rommel's Afrika Korps, were not languishing in dungeons. They were housed in standard U.S. Army tar paper barracks. But what they did with those barracks was the truly shocking part. Under the guidance of their ranking German officer, and with the tacit approval of the American command, the prisoners transformed the camp into a functioning, if isolated, community. They established their own governance structure, created complex educational programs, published a camp newspaper, and, critically, built extraordinary recreational facilities. At Hearne, they constructed a fully functional theater, complete with stage rigging and lighting, capable of seating hundreds. They cultivated elaborate gardens, built a sophisticated camp orchestra, and even installed a fully equipped athletic field. The official U.S. Army policy, enshrined in the Geneva Convention, mandated that officers could not be compelled to work, and enlisted men could only be compelled to work for pay. This led to a strange environment of enforced, often creative idleness for many, particularly the officers. The sheer resourcefulness of the Wehrmacht soldiers, combined with the U.S. Army's generous allowance of materials, lumber, paint, tools, to keep the men occupied and out of trouble, led to a cultural flowering behind the wire. But this external calm masked a profound internal psychological war. The POW camps were not homogeneous communities of defeated soldiers. They were a microcosm of the Third Reich itself, a place where the ideological battle between the true believers and the disillusioned was fought with brutal, deadly precision. The German prisoners quickly divided into two distinct hostile factions: the Schwarze, the blacks, and the Weisse, the whites. The Schwarze were the fanatical, unrepentant Nazis, often led by SS or dedicated Wehrmacht officers, who sought to maintain the purity of National Socialist ideology within the camp walls. The Weisse were the anti-Nazis, the neutrals, or those simply tired of the war and the toxic ideology that had brought them to a Texas prison. The US military, often oblivious or simply unwilling to intervene in what they saw as internal squabbles, allowed the Nazi hierarchy to flourish. The ranking German officer, the Vertrauensmann, was almost invariably a dedicated Nazi, and he and his associates used fear, intimidation, and violence to enforce strict ideological conformity. The result was a shadow war in the heart of Texas. The most notorious incident of this internal brutality occurred just south of Dallas, at the POW camp near Mexia, Texas. On the night of March 12, 1944, a group of fanatical Nazis, believing the man to be a traitor, dragged Private First Class Helmut Flichinger from his bed. Flichinger, a former member of the Afrika Korps, had been openly critical of Hitler and the war. He was beaten, tortured, and ultimately hanged in the camp latrine, a chilling message to anyone considering abandoning the cause. Similar incidents of re-education and murder occurred across the network of Texas camps, from Camp Wallace to Camp Alva. The U.S. Army's response was often sluggish, rooted in a desire to avoid provoking mass unrest. However, the subsequent trials for the Mexia murders, where 5 Nazi ringleaders were convicted and eventually executed at Fort Leavenworth in 1945, sent a clear, brutal message that the American system of justice would eventually prevail. The psychological battlefield remained, however, the hardest part of the war to control. Yet, despite the ideological violence and the ever-present tension, the human desire for normalcy, especially during the holidays, was irrepressible. And it is here, in the cold, dusty barracks of Central Texas, that we find the most astonishing historical paradox. The year is 1944. The Battle of the Bulge is raging in the Ardennes, a desperate final counteroffensive by the German army. The war is far from over, and American casualties are mounting at an alarming rate. Yet 5,000 miles away from the front lines, in the heart of Camp Swift near Bastrop, Texas, a different kind of engagement was taking place. The holiday season was always a challenge for the U.S. Guards. The German prisoners, particularly those from Catholic Bavaria or the Protestant North, held Christmas, Weihnachten, with a deep cultural reverence that surpassed the American celebration. To deny them the ability to observe it was to invite severe morale problems and, potentially, mass unrest. So, the U.S. Army, in a move that today seems utterly confounding, not only allowed but actively supported the German Christmas celebrations. At Camp Swift, the prisoners spent weeks preparing. They meticulously carved elaborate wooden nativity scenes, transforming rough lumber into delicate works of art. They baked traditional German cookies using ingredients requisitioned from the U.S. Quartermaster Corps. They decorated their barracks with pine boughs and handcrafted ornaments, often using the scarce material resources available to them to create an atmosphere that momentarily erased the grim reality of the wire. The pinnacle of this strange wartime truce came on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. The camp orchestras, featuring musicians who had once played in Berlin or Munich, performed solemn renditions of Stille Nacht. The U.S. Guards, often young men from rural Texas or the Deep South, found themselves standing watch over a scene that looked, smelled, and sounded exactly like the Christmas they knew. only spoken in a foreign tongue. And this leads us directly to the astonishing and almost unbelievable core of this story. Because, in a stunning display of wartime absurdity, the reality was that on Christmas 1944, when Texas Guards played football with Nazi prisoners, it was a casual, unofficial fraternization born of boredom, shared humanity, and the temporary power of a single holiday. At Camp Swift and similar camps like Camp Bowie, the German prisoners had organized robust athletic programs, playing soccer and increasingly American football, which they had learned from the Guards and through the camp's radio. On Christmas Day 1944, the lines blurred entirely. Accounts from former Guards and surviving POWs detail the impromptu games that broke out on the dusty parade grounds. A group of Wehrmacht enlisted men, perhaps from the 90th Light Infantry Division, would challenge a squad of their American captors. The game was often touch football, played in the cold Texas air, with prisoners wearing hastily fashioned jerseys and the Guards often still in their olive drab uniforms. This was not a sanctioned event. It was a calculated human risk taken by the American officers and enlisted men. The fear of fraternization was real and constantly reinforced by military regulations. But on that one day, the shared experience of the holiday, the mutual respect forged by months of close, if adversarial contact, and the simple desire for a moment of competitive escape overrode the military protocol. The US Guards knew these men were the enemy. They knew their comrades were dying overseas fighting these same soldiers. Yet they also knew the men standing across the scrimmage line were cold, homesick, and for a few hours, just young men looking for a game. It was a moment of profound, localized peace in the middle of a global war. The experience of the POWs extended far beyond the camp wire. The immense agricultural industry of Texas, particularly the cotton and sugar beet harvests, was suffering from a massive labor shortage due to the war effort. The solution was to utilize the German and Italian prisoners under the Geneva Convention's labor provisions. This led to a massive statewide work program that brought the Kriegies into direct, daily contact with the local population. From the sugar beet fields of Hereford to the cotton gins near Mexia, thousands of German prisoners were bussed out daily to work on private farms. They were paid 80 cents a day, a wage that, while small, allowed them to purchase canteen items, including American cigarettes, candy, and soap. This daily interaction with farmers, housewives, and local townspeople created an entirely new set of cultural exchanges and, occasionally, complications. The prisoners were often surprised by the relative prosperity of the American farmer. They expected a nation struggling under the weight of war. Instead, they saw modern machinery, well-stocked kitchens, and a level of material comfort that contrasted sharply with the deprivation they had experienced in Germany since 1939. For the Texans, the experience was equally jarring. Many had never seen a German, let alone a soldier of the Reich. Initial fear and suspicion quickly faded, replaced by pragmatic tolerance, and in some cases, genuine, if guarded, affection. The prisoners were, by and large, disciplined and hardworking. They were polite and, surprisingly, often shared photos of their families back home. Stories abound of this strange coexistence. A farmer near Camp Bowie might invite his German labor crew into his kitchen for iced tea during a break. A German POW, having learned basic English, might teach a Texas farmhand a few words of German. In a legendary twist of fate, Many of the German prisoners were surprised to find that many of the US guards and local civilians they interacted with had German ancestry themselves, creating a strange familial connection that transcended the war. The escapes from Texas camps, while providing dramatic stories, were almost universally farcical and short-lived. The most famous case might be that of Private Johannes Voch, who escaped from Camp Hearne in 1945. His ambition was not to rejoin the war, but simply to find his way to a specific Texas town where he had heard there was a particularly attractive young woman. He was recaptured quickly, primarily because a man in a faded German uniform with nowhere to go tended to stand out in central Texas. The vastness of the American landscape, combined with the language barrier and the lack of an underground support network, ensured that serious, high-risk escapes were non-existent. The prisoners learned quickly that the best place to be was inside the wire, where the food was adequate, the labor was paid, and the war was a distant memory. As the war in Europe drew to a cataclysmic close in the spring of 1945, the focus of the US Army shifted from merely housing the prisoners to actively denazifying them. This was the final and perhaps most brutal psychological phase of their Texas imprisonment. The US Army, realizing the deep ideological indoctrination of many of the Krieges, initiated a massive mandatory re-education program. At camps like Camp Hearne, a select group of anti-Nazi intellectuals and educators were given access to American resources. They established libraries stocked with non-Nazi literature, taught democratic principles, and organized lectures designed to dismantle the National Socialist worldview. The hardest part of this re-education, however, was the unveiling of the ultimate truth of the Holocaust. Following the liberation of the concentration camps, the US Army began showing mandatory film footage to the German POWs. Raw, unedited, horrifying images of the atrocities at Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau. The reaction was split. For the anti-Nazis and the disillusioned, it was a confirmation of the evil they already suspected. For the hardcore Nazis, the Schwarze, the reaction was often denial, violent protest, and a firm belief that the films were American propaganda, the same denial that would plague post-war Germany. The US Army's documentation of these screenings reveals the profound psychological shock and the lasting bitterness this final confrontation with reality caused. VE Day in May 1945 did not mean immediate freedom for the Krieges. The logistical challenges of repatriating hundreds of thousands of prisoners were immense, and the US government was wary of sending home a large contingent of potentially radicalized young men. The repatriation process stretched out until late 1946. The final departures were often fraught with emotion. Many of the prisoners, having spent up to 3 years in the relative safety and comfort of Texas, were hesitant to return to a ruined, occupied Germany. They had formed strange bonds with their captors and the local population. They had worked the land, learned a new language, and for many had their first taste of a non-authoritarian society. The legacy of the German POWs in Texas is a profound and often overlooked chapter of World War II. It stands as a testament to the strange, humanizing power of proximity, even in the midst of a total war. The camps, now mostly vanished or marked only by quiet, historical markers, left an indelible mark on the landscape and the memory of the Texans who interacted with them. They were a bizarre temporary colony of the enemy, an unexpected cultural exchange that proved that even the most dedicated soldier separated from the front lines could still be reduced or elevated to a simple human being looking for a game of football on a cold Christmas day. Which POW story should we cover next? A. The Sheriff. B. The Christmas Truce. Comment